All right, why don't we get started this morning? So, welcome to the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology, and thank you very much for making the trek over here today. Dr. Steve McNulty is interviewing to become the Arboretum Director, and he gave a seminar on his vision for the Arboretum yesterday at the Arboretum, and today's focus for his seminar is more of a research science-based focus. And Steve is a kind of native son of Madison. His family settled in Northport on the north side of Lake Mendota there, and he got his undergraduate and master's degree here at the University of Wisconsin. He got his master's here in the Department of Forestry before he merged with wildlife, and then he followed John Neighbors out to New Hampshire and got his PhD out there. And ever since then he's been with the USDA Forest Service, and most recently he's come to us from Raleigh, North Carolina, and the Climate Change Science Hub of the USDA Forest Service. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve and let him take it from here.
You've got another slide or two, I think.
Well, I think he's going to, I just asked him, I think he wanted to, you're going to
I'll
summarize that.
I think you did a better job than I did.
Well, you want me to finish out the hour?
Sure, let's hear what you got to say.
So Steve, thank you and welcome.
All right, thanks. All right, well, thank you for being here. It's good to be back. It's not as warm as the physical welcome, but it's been emotionally pretty warm. I appreciate the invitation. All right, so today's lecture, I know some folks were at the lecture yesterday, and this is going to be similar, but a little bit different. It's going to be a little more heavily focused on some of the research and my research and how I see that fitting into what I like to see for a scope, a broader scope of research at the University of Wisconsin's Arboretum. I actually did work out in the Arboretum in the early and mid 1980s, and it was good to be back and see how much has changed, and relative to the other parts of campus, how much hasn't changed. So it's good to be there. So anyhow, that's going to be the expansion of the talk today. And so as I see it, there's really two missions to the Arboretum. The first one is the Arboretum as a place, and maybe this is the part of the Arboretum that we're most familiar with. It's the Arboretum for doing basic research, as a place where we can use to kind of showcase some of the work done there, and the facilities and the communities there. A lot of community service, and I think in the last, well, since I've been gone, maybe that's really become the focus of the Arboretum. What most people think of as the Arboretum is a great place to go take a run or go skiing. Really the outreach of the Arboretum as a place. And then finally the teaching opportunity. So I know a lot of the faculty go out to the Arboretum to conduct different classes. But the research aspect of it maybe isn't as strong as maybe it once was, or at least maybe with the departments it's not as strong. So I'm going to talk about the Arboretum as a place. I'm also going to talk about the Arboretum and the Arboretum idea as an idea. So conservation is what really Leopold started with the Arboretum, and a place to show and to research conservation issues. That idea is also extends beyond the Arboretum boundaries, the 1,200 acres which are the Arboretum, and expanding that to the state, regional, even global scale. There's no reason not to do that, but particularly at some of the larger scales that hasn't been done to date to any great extent, and that's really coming here. My proposal to the search committee and what I like to do with the Arboretum is going to focus mainly at those larger scales, using the Arboretum as a focal point for that type of idea of work. Partnership building, grant raising, and increasing the prominence of the UW system as a whole. You know, the Arboretum is a beautiful place, and they bring the folks out there to look at it, but it's mainly as a place, and not the idea of conservation and what that represents. And I'd like to change some of that. Okay, so within those two ideas, the place of the Arboretum and the idea of the Arboretum, there's really three things I see, three levels of strength. One is the great, what's the really good stuff already going on there, what's not as it could be, could really improve some of these areas, and what's missing. And what I'm going to focus on really for today's talk is going to be on the good and the missing, or not as good as it can be and the missing. The great is kind of self-explanatory in some ways, and the great also largely has to do with the outreach, the things that aren't research-based. So the great, over the last 50 years, the Arboretum has become a showcase for restoration ecology as a practice, and the amount of community service and outreach is truly amazing. What they do out there, I don't know if you have ever a chance to go to the website or to see some of the announcements or participate in any of the programs or things that are going on. But it's really staggering if you go there to find out, come on in, I got your place right up here. Come on in. You're not interrupting. And the amount of work that's going on there really is quite remarkable. So I'm not going to go through the details on this because they're really not research-based, and I talked about them yesterday. But everything from enrichment series, lectures, and partnerships, and walks, and volunteer days, and tours, and all of this in the support of the to support the working community and aspects of the UW Arboretum. Really good stuff. So if you haven't looked at it, you don't know about it, you should check it out. But that's not what we're going to talk about. Okay, we're going to start out with the not as good as it can be. And you know, as part of the UW system, the Arboretum is at its core the research and teaching laboratory. So this is what I knew of the Arboretum from when I was here in the 80s, and really what the focus was, it seemed like at that point, and what I think that we need to get back to, at least really put more emphasis on. The Arboretum should always be community outreach and have that community participation. That seems to be going well. There's a group called Friends of the Arboretum that are really helping to support that work along with the Arboretum staff. And I think that's fine, but I think this research and teaching needs to improve. And so let me go into some detail about that. So there's been decades where back in the 50s, really the Arboretum was one of the real leaders in this idea about conservation management and its actual application of those skills to the development of the prairies and the forest ecosystems. However, I did a review of the UW Arboretum website, and it lists only 9 publications since 2011 to present. And of those 9 publications, there were only 6 lead authors. Now, I know there's probably work going on at the Arboretum that's not listed on the website, and there are probably other things that haven't been added to the website. But you know, anytime you're seeing numbers like this for such a large area that has such potential prominence with the university, and over that kind of time period, it's a bit troubling. So to me, that indicates either that the site isn't being maintained or there's severe lack of research present at the Arboretum. So over the last day or so, I've been trying to explore why that is. What's the cause of this apparent lack of work being done out there? Is it a function of just logistics? Is it a function of not really realizing that this area is open? Is it a matter of not feeling really welcome to do the work out there? There's a reason for it. And over the last day, I've really been getting a better picture of what that might be. But where there are no publications, there's no graduate students, no postdocs, no administrative support for research to do that work. And so the Arboretum, you know, like everybody else in the world, we're short on cash. We need to expand that work, and we need to focus on trying to increase the amount of work going on out there. So one of my primary tasks is to learn out why that's not happening and then what can be done to rectify that problem. So for recommendations for not as good as it could be, determining what's causing those bottlenecks in place based on the research interest for the University Arboretum, and remove those obstacles. I think I've come a long way just in a day in understanding what some of those obstacles and bottlenecks would be, and it's a matter of beginning to promote and to market and give a welcome ad out for the Arboretum. It's right here. Come on down. Come on down. And to put that out so that folks know that they can work out there and they're welcome to work out there. And not only just working out there as a place, but begin to bring in collaboration with the folks that are working out there, the staff, and the other researchers that are there that can provide that support. And then begin to do that, what I'd like to do is once we begin to develop this relationship again with not only forestry, but botany departments, the Nelson Institute, is begin to tie in the place-based research with what I think is one of the major missing elements of research that should be part of the Arboretum's base mission. I'm going to discuss that next. And that's the missing part. So when since the Arboretum was first founded in the 1930s, and Leopold's passing in 1948, much has changed. And what's changed since then is the 21st century. You know, there's been enormous change in both the technology and our understanding since the mid part of the 20th century. So conservation issues of the mid-20th century were things such as deforestation, habitat loss, overgrazing, soil erosion, ecosystem deterioration, sulfur and heavy metal pollution. These were all common problems back then. And to the credit of a lot of individuals and agencies and regulations, they're not gone, but they're not at the levels that they used to be, in most cases. Now we still have problems with things like habitat loss and encroachment and habitat fragmentation. We see that. The Arboretum is really a great place to study that kind of interaction between natural ecosystems and the urban environment. I think that's one of the areas from a place-based standpoint that could be exploited and could certainly be expanded on. A lot of work that's going on with urban LTERs around the country. The Arboretum could fit into a role of facilitating or helping to augment some of that work. However, there's a lot of regional problems which have been significantly improved. I think deforestation, overgrazing, erosion, again, we still have some problems, but it's not the mass wasting and the mass erosion that they had at the turn of the century. But they're new problems, right? So as we develop old problems and we solve them and we move on, or at least get them under control and manageable, we start talking about this sort of stuff. CO2 concentrations, really came about in 1990 when major work started to be done on this with the Global Change Research Act, and that's when I got my job, just came out of college, I got my PhD in 91. In 1990, Congress passed the Global Change Research Act, which gave about $2 billion a year for funding for global change research. I've been doing that work ever since, but this issue of CO2 increases and the impacts that have on global surface temperatures over the last 1,000 years, kind of the classic graph, squiggles along, we get to the Industrial Revolution, and we start to skyrocket. So a lot of the work that was originally done in this was on the trends of climate, but really what we're focusing on now in the climate change arena is climate variability, stuff we're having out there right now. What's causing these extreme amplitude shifts? What's causing the droughts, those sorts of things. We see from the linology of Mendota, the long-term trend and the steady decline, more or less, with the exception of this year, which is going to completely turn that. Rush Limbaugh is going to be talking about that, as soon as that comes out, and now that the lakes are frozen much longer than they have been in the last 100 years. But beyond that, we're seeing those sorts of impacts. We're also seeing this change in drought severity. So 2012, July, we had a severe drought. Population growth, all the problems associated with that and the impacts of people in and around the area. Changes in water demand. All of the demands, for example, next to the Arboretum, there's the Nakoma Golf Course. Maybe drawdown of the water there might be impacting the fens at the Arboretum itself. These are issues that none of these were really major problems back in the 40s and 50s. They've really developed since that time. So we have one period, we'll have a record drought in 2012. Then in September of 2010, we have these record floods. Well, we have floods again last year with devastating near-record floods and farmers after last year's drought. So this variability of climate, again, are issues that need to be addressed and haven't historically been an issue. So I guess what I'm getting at with all of this is that conservation is still the main focus of the Arboretum and always should be, but the issues associated with conservation and conservation management need to adapt. And we need to be able to address those issues to remain relevant in the questions of today. And everything suggests that from here on out, all that's going to happen is just going to get warmer. Composite a whole bunch of general circulation models all suggest one thing. Some say it's going to get warmer slower. Right now we're in a little bit of a leveling off of the warming. Some models may suggest that, but all of them basically suggest it's going to get warmer over the long term. Nothing says that what's going to happen is going to level off permanently. It just won't. And then finally, there's the whole list of all the endangered plants and insects and animals, mussels, amphibians, all of those from the DNR, Wisconsin DNR files. They literally go on for pages. So these are the issues that we're having to deal with and we need to adapt to from a standpoint of conservation. So that gets back to the question, what should the University Arboretum do to carry out Leopold's mission? And this is the conservation and restore Arboretum lands advance restoration ecology, and foster a land ethic. And I think what I'd like to really focus on right now is this fostering a land ethic. And also the conservation of not only arboretum lands, but of all lands. And I think if we focus on that, we can expand the scope of work that we're doing at the Arboretum to beyond just those 1,200 acres. And I think there's good premise for doing that. Here's out of a Nature paper that I pulled off from last November, I think. It's cited somewhere in here. Oh, November 13th. And it says global change, ecology must evolve. And basically what it talks about is, you know, with all of the changes that are going on, we have to think of new and creative ways to do the ecosystem science and the ways of kind of this pace by pace aren't working anymore because the issues are changing too fast. And this paper really draws on a paper from a couple of years earlier, which is conservation science outside the comfort zone. And basically, you know, you can see the banner headline here, but this is basically what it talks about. Researchers like to work on projects that start small and slowly scale up. They must think bigger and faster, says Adelman, to tackle today's problems in time. And so the premise of this being that by the time we get to a solution by doing these incremental steps, that issue is already passed. We've already gone past a point that we could address it, and the next issues arrive. And so we need to think larger and grander scale to do this work. So these are things that, you know, Aldo Leopold couldn't conceive of practically, conceptually, yes, but, you know, things such as the computational computer capacity you have now, GIS, the modeling statistical tools we have, the modeling that's developed since that time, it's all really, you know, beyond what was available then, but it allows us to begin to think along those terms. So to evolve the scope of the UW Arboretum to reflect the enhanced complexity of the 21st century is what the remainder of this talk is going to be about. I'm going to give you 3 brief examples to do that. The first one is the complexity using just water as an example. I'm a co-developer of a model called WSSI, Water Supply Stress Index. And it's a model that looks at water supply and demand, not just of ecosystems, but also from a human standpoint. So it would take things such as land use change, reservoir capacity, the value of water, population change, climate, demands for water from ecosystems, from forests, grasslands, water bodies, from people, so urban areas, residential, commercial, industrial lands, and it needs to balance all of this out. Where are the areas on the landscape where maybe we have sufficient water or an abundance of water, and where are those areas we don't have enough water? And this is a conservation issue because conserving the land is also about conserving the water resource. So if we have, for example, in Raleigh in 2007, we had a real severe drought. And they were getting to the point where they needed to decide how low they could draw down some of our reservoirs without impacting the biodiversity of those reservoirs and the downstream flow for some particularly endangered species. And it was a matter of one side saying, we need the water to drink for all these purposes, versus are we going to let some salamander or mussel dictate that? And these are practical issues, but that's as much conservation science as it is to restore Curtis Prairie, but on a bigger scale. So for example, with the WSSI model, we've developed this where this particular model runs at a monthly time step. These are actually 8-digit watershed from a USGS hydrologic code standpoint. We now run the model at 12-digit, but at that level it's kind of hard to see some of the watersheds. So 12 digits much finer, about 8 to 10 times finer resolution than this. Monthly time step we can run under historic conditions. We can then project it into the future. So we can start out with a base projection like this where we're looking at, this is a projection of 2013, which is a particularly wet year over much of the area. And basically the red areas represent areas of water stress, and the green areas represent areas of abundance of water. And this is, so this would be the amount of water stress based on the environmental conditions and also on human need for water. So areas like Atlanta have this area of red, not because maybe they don't have a lot of precipitation or they didn't have a lot of water resource, but the demand is even higher than that resource. So you'll see a lot of the west, particularly large urban areas, will stick out with this particular model. So you do that under historic conditions. And then you can do what-if scenarios. In this case, here's an example. We plug in the effects of a 20% conversion of forest to grasslands. And so what would happen as a function of, sorry, the hounds are calling me. So what would be the effect then of removing this forest cover and replacing it with grasslands? Well, you can see that there would be some increases in water yield up to maybe 80 millimeters per year of flow, but in a lot of areas it wouldn't make that much difference. In other words, you can cut 20% of the forest, but if you have no water, that difference in cut doesn't make much of a difference. Every time we get a new chief of the Forest Service, I get called up there to brief the chief on climate change and water issues. Well, the first thing they want to do is cut down big chunks of land to resolve water crisis issues. Well, this is kind of a model that would say, well, you could cut down pretty much Wyoming of water, and it's still going to be dry in Wyoming. Whereas if you did that in somewhere like around the Atlanta area, you may get a really significant increase in water yield. So it helps to show what those impacts would be. So changes in vegetation cover. Also, it shows how important groundwater supply. This is that same map that I showed before for a wet year, October 2013, but this is what happens when there's no groundwater taken up. So if you remove the groundwater component of these models, you can see that no matter how climate changes, even in a wet year, you're going to have issues with groundwater supply and overall water availability. So these are the kinds of conservation models that can be applied at a scale much larger than the Arboretum, but have real application as to conservation issues. Oops, forgot to do that. So we have a website for that, and you can just Google WASI. If you type in WASI and water, you'll find if you just type in WASI, you'll get a plumber, and there's also a meat market, I think, in New Jersey that's called WASI or something. So use the water and you can do that. But basically what we've developed is a tool of this WASI model that you can go online. You can put any watershed in put Dane County in here, and it will pull up the climate databases for that, historic and projected, and you can actually do your own scenarios of change for vegetation, for population, all kinds of different things. And so land managers are beginning to use this model to do those kinds of what-if scenarios. Another second example I wanted to talk about is not a model, but a tool. From a conservation standpoint, there's amazing capability now in the internet and the tools that we develop for it. This is a tool that I developed called the Template for Assessing Climate Change Impacts and Management Options. So it's called Takko for short. And basically what we've done with this is we've developed this kind of a template where, again, you can type in your location. It will search this database of scientific literature based on your location, based on the interest that you have, if it's biodiversity or if it's timber management or if it's water. And it will cross-reference that to look at stresses. So what are the climatic stresses like drought or wildfire or insect or flooding? You get to check which ones you're interested in. It'll cross-reference that, and it will tell you which particular stresses may impact the areas of interest that you have, such as biodiversity. And then it will further cross-reference that with more literature that will tell you what management options you have to address those stresses. So what are the types of published types of management options that have been out there that have been proven that says these are the things you can do to reduce or mitigate some of those problems. And then it will generate that into a report that then you can go and read more about or have the information on it. Basically what it does is it allows a land manager to do in about 5 minutes what would have taken about 3 months in a literature search and report generation. So again, this is the type of tool that we can develop now through conservation that allows much more access to this kind of information than we ever had before. So finally, the last part I'd like to talk about then are these new areas of research. So what are the kind of developing types of research that are out there that we didn't even know we should be doing before? And I love to quote Donald Rumsfeld here from a 2002 press interview, and I love just to read it, where he says, "As we know there are known knowns, there are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns." That is to say, there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. The press made a lot of fun at him talking, of course, about the Gulf War, I think at the time, and you know, the press thought that was the most ridiculous thing. Honestly, it was probably the most profound statement the man ever made. Because, you know, it talks about there are things we know. 1 + 1 is 2. There are things we don't know but can probably figure out. 3,000 divided by 17.2 equals something. We don't know what it is, but we can figure it out. But then there's those questions that we don't even know we know. And those are the ones that are probably going to have the most impact. These are the ones that we're not working towards solving the answers for, and when they come up, we're least prepared to address them. The same is true with conservation biology. There are going to be these really unique and weird combinations that start to evolve as we progress more and more into this arena of variability of climate. And when those happen, they're going to come on fast. And the change will be sudden, and it will probably be dramatic, and we won't be prepared. So this idea of these unknown unknowns is one of the areas that I think is the most interesting, the most serious, and the most understudied. And those are the kinds of things that we need to study at the Arboretum, because that's very much in line with the conservation ethic of the Arboretum, very much in line with Eldefold's philosophy, the things that wouldn't have been on the radar back in the 40s and before. Let me give you one example of that. Back in 2007, I published a paper based on using a simple mass balance equation, real simple thing, just to estimate the critical loads and exceedance of forest soils across the conterminous U.S. So basically what this is, nitrogen and sulfur deposition, what we call acid rain, impacting the U.S., working in conjunction with the biota, with the plants and soil there. And where are those areas where the amount of this acid, this sulfur and nitrogen is coming down at a rate beyond which the ecosystem can absorb it? When you get more of this acid rain than the ecosystem can absorb, you exceed the capacity. When you exceed the capacity, bad things happen. Right? The ecosystem becomes much more susceptible to deterioration and dieback. So in 2007, I ran the simple mass balance equation, 1 kilometer resolution for the whole United States for all forested lands. And what it came up with is that these are the areas that are in exceedance, wherever you don't see gray, wherever you don't see white, because these are not forested lands. But wherever you see any of this area, as it gets from yellow to green to blue to red, more exceedance. So, you know, not surprisingly, most of that is in New England, in these areas which get high deposition rates. Well, there's a little down here from chicken farming. That have these really high deposition rates, areas where there's a lot of concern. So as a conservation biologist, you'd say, well, you know, this area here has some pretty prominent areas of deposition and high exceedances. Maybe we need to go out there and start to study these areas to see if there's actually a problem. So you wouldn't have to study the whole New England, but just focus on some of these areas as possible areas. They really make ecologists or conservation biologists a lot easier, so their time goes a lot farther. They help to speed along what we're doing. So in 2007, I did that. But I started to think, you know, how does climate change interact with acid rain, with this critical acid load? So I began to put some thoughts together and developed a second paper that came out in 2010, conceptual framework for defining a critical load under a changing climate. And I won't go into the details on this, but I started to think, well, maybe climate change could have negative or positive impacts on the amount of acid that a forest ecosystem takes up. So I put this paper together. Then I further defined that and said, well, we can tie some models together. We have a model that we can use to look at forest productivity and nutrient uptake and look at how that then can interact with base cation weathering, because that'll change with temperature. And I put together another paper that I think came out last year, Climate Change Impacts on Forest Soil Critical Acid Loads and Exceedances at a National Scale. So we reran that equation, and we had some really interesting things we found. We found that acid rain and climate change actually can be a positive benefit. Because what happens with acid rain is you are getting a critical load more than your forest can take up. So that's a bad thing. But what climate change does, it can increase your weathering rates of your soils. So the amount of nutrients, the amount of base cations like calcium and magnesium that comes out of your rock increases with temperature. And that can help to neutralize some of the acid rain. So what we're finding is that in areas like New England where it's cold and the temperature's warming, the amount of area in acid rain actually goes down. You know, that's an unknown. We didn't really think about that as happening, and until we started to think about it, that's kind of counterintuitive. But when you think about it and you see it, now it makes a little bit of sense. So that's what this paper kind of goes into, is how acid rain and climate change can interact together. But then I wanted to, another study that I did came up with something completely off the wall. And that is, we did some study back in 2000 where in the mountains of North Carolina we had some severe droughts at the time. It's a 3-year drought, and we went out and we did some samples up in the high elevation where they have spruce and fir stands. And what we found is that there were some deaths of the spruce up in those high elevations, but it wasn't what we expected. When we took tree cores of those trees, we found that the trees that were growing the fastest were actually the ones that were dying. The ones that looked like they would have been healthy stands were the ones that were dying. Where these other trees, which looked really scraggly and not much crown on top of them, and we took the growth rates and they were really small, the ones that we would think would be the first to die didn't die. And so I started to develop a hypothesis on how that could have happened. And what I came up with was this. Under the historic range of climate, what we generally see is that if you go from episodic stress, from no stress to extreme frequent stress on this part of the graph, and you have two types of forests. One is a chronically stressed forest that grows on crummy soil, doesn't real sandy maybe, not a lot of water holding capacity, really kind of a scrubby looking forest. And you have a non-stressed forest. And you look at the rate of mortality on these two when you have some kind of a low episodic stress like a beetle outbreak or a drought on top of that. What you see is these chronically stressed forests have some increase in the mortality, right? So those trees kind of have some mortality loss, but a non-stressed forest, a really rich, healthy forest, nothing. Doesn't hurt them. They slow down in growth, but you don't see a lot of mortality associated with it. However, under climate change, what we're seeing is this shift to more of these episodic stress, these more frequent, intensive stress, and chronic stress is always kind of chronic stress. So we get this shift from current climate over to future climate. And so now what we have is we have much more of this incidence of these really frequent, extreme events of episodic stress. And what we're beginning to see and what we saw in the woods was that historically, this would be the end of the graph right here. But when you add in that more extreme stress, we may get a secondary stress. And what happens with that secondary stress is, from the first stress, some of the trees died. It freed up a little bit of our resource, a little bit of the water, a little bit of the nutrients. The plants kind of took a big breath and said, okay, it's bad, but now we lost Johnny Tree over here, but the rest of us are going to be okay. We have a little more resource. But we move along, we get a second stress. And what happens is they say, oh my gosh, we have this stress, but thankfully, because some of these trees died here, we have a little resource left over. And so when we have this secondary stress, what happens is we get a little more decline, but then it levels off. What happens with these non-stressed forests is we have no decline, they get more and more stress until they kind of hit this breaking point, boom. And then it switches over, and at the extreme stress, these previously non-stressed forests all die. Where the chronically stressed forests have increased mortality, but they survive it. So it's kind of this inverse of what we would consider to be chronic stress relationships. And it's not that it's changing the ecosystems, what it is we've never seen this part of the graph. It's like if you had this room, and you had part of it covered up with cloth, and this whole side of the room was painted white. And you couldn't see this side of the room, and you'd say, well, what color is this whole room? You'd say, white. We can see that. You'd extrapolate this side's white, but it's painted black. You remove the cloth, and it's black. It's not that the room wasn't black before, we just didn't see it. Same thing here. It's not that the ecosystems are behaving differently, we just never experienced this level of chronic and episodic stress. And so what I'm proposing is that all of the models suggest that we're going to see more extreme, more frequent episodic stress. And as we do that, our management of these ecosystems may need to change in ways that we never even considered. This unknown, including our conservation science. We can't do that working just at a 1,200 acre landscape in one part of Wisconsin. To test this, to look at this, it needs a much broader area, a wide range of ecosystems that can only be achieved by working at a much larger scale. So the idea of conservation to continue Leopold's legacy of conservation science needs to expand. So anyhow, I wrote this up in a paper that just came out, I guess, last month. The Rise of the Mediocre Forest, Why Chronically Stressed Trees May Better Survive Extreme Episodic Climate Variability. So there's a lot more conjecture in there than there is hard data, but it proposes this idea, and it's an intriguing idea. And as I've talked to colleagues about this, I'm getting more and more of these things where, you know, we saw something similar to that, we couldn't really explain it. And it seems like this type of unknown is maybe more common than we think, but it's all unknowns. We don't know to look for it, so we're missing it. So I think part of the Arboretum's mission is to focus on those things which are just on the periphery of our vision and try to be forward in thinking and study those and get ahead of the curve, the way the Nature papers suggest, so that what we're able to do is stay in front of conservation biology instead of always playing catch-up. So these times are changing, as they say, and the process of moving forward in the process of moving UW Arboretum forward, I think we need to do a few things. The community aspects of Arboretums are exemplary, to say the least. We need to promote and support those areas, and they're working well. So that's really, I think, one of the strongest parts right now. Historically, the Arboretum has had a lot of, it's been respected, and the UW Foundation is there also to help community outreach. But we need to remove the bottlenecks in the research space, and we need to foster a more welcoming research environment. So one of the reasons I'm here is to say that if I end up being the director over there, job one is to make sure that everyone in every department knows that the Arboretum is open for business, for research business, wants to collaborate, wants to work with folks to make that a really viable place to do the research. Not only as point-based, and again I'm just going to keep making that point, not only as the Arboretum itself, but the idea of conservation for the Arboretum in general. And we need to expand that, as I just said, from an idea-based learning, teaching, research laboratory. We need to make this more continental and even global scale research. There's not a lot going on, so we need to create that atmosphere and encourage the work. We also need to develop the relationships with folks like the Nelson Institute of Environmental Studies. Had some good talk with the Nelson folks, and are really excited about the work they're doing and the scale they're doing it at. And so I think that's a lot of opportunity. We need to also partner with other research organizations outside the UW system. So let's get our house in order. Let's get the work that we're doing here at the UW as a group together, and then let's go outside. Then let's start to invite other collaborators in from outside the UW system to help us in the conservation effort and the scaling up the work that's being done there. We also need to communicate what we're doing. These are changes, probably more change at the Arboretum than has been done in quite a while. And so this change in mission shouldn't be done alone. Communication is everything. We want to make sure that our partners and the benefactors at the Arboretum know about all this every step of the way and have input to that. And ultimately what I'd like to do at some point down the road is to establish the University of Wisconsin Institute of Global Conservation Studies out there. I think that this is a niche that really hasn't been filled, especially at the largest scale, and I think it's a niche just primed and ready for the Arboretum to begin to develop toward. There are some good examples of where this has already been done to a large extent. One of them is the Flagler Carey Arboretum. It's an arboretum about 2,000 acres in Millbrook, New York. Been there, it's absolutely gorgeous and beautiful. But it's not just the Arboretum. What it is, it's part of the Carey Institute. And the work that's been going on there literally for years, decades. Gene Lycan starting in '83, and in the last 30 years it's been going on. If you look at where a lot of this work is, a lot of this work is far, far outside of New York, right? But it's looking at the conservation and ecology studies all around the world. It's taking what was an Arboretum-focused research project and expanding it to a much larger scope. Still within the scope of what the Arboretum would like to do, but at a much larger scale with a lot more implications. And financially, it's been really successful for them. You know, it's amazing what you can find on the internet, including their 2012 tax returns. You know, but they had gross receipts of about $28 million last year, compared to about 1.4 for the Arboretum, our Arboretum. And if you look at the breakdown of where that came from, it breaks down here, but basically the revenues are what you want to look at. Contributions from grants, about $5.4 million. Investments, they got about $110 million in endowments that they're drawing investments from for $8.7 million. About $300,000 in other. They have a total operating budget of about $14.4 million in total revenue that they can operate with. Now that would do a lot of science. That would be doing a lot of science. That didn't happen early. You know, it took 30 years of brilliant work from Gene Likens and many, many others. But there's no reason with the mental power and the history of the Arboretum that we couldn't do the same thing here with conservation science. And that's basically the proposal I've been making to the search committee and to the folks that we've been talking with. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and we can open it up for questions. Any questions? Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about specifically what you mean when you say create an atmosphere that would encourage the types of continental or global scale projects that you are using as examples?
Yeah. Did everyone hear the question, Jack? Did you hear the question? Okay. Yeah, I think that if you're let me give you I like to do analogies. So let's say that you're a leather person, you're a leather repair person, and you have shoes in the window. And you go inside the leather store and there's shoes all over the counters, there's shoes on the shelves. All you see are shoes. And it's a leather repair shop, and you know you see shoes everywhere. You're going to go in there and think that he mainly does shoes. That's what he does. And so you have your purse and you need repair to your briefcase, and you may not bring it there. You're going to look for someone who maybe has briefcases or purses in the window. I think the same is true about the Arboretum. We focused really well on maybe the finest scale of study there. And so people get to think that that's what we do at the Arboretum, and I'm using the royal we at this point. You know, that's what we do at the Arboretum, is that we focus on that really fine scale, because that's what they see. But it doesn't mean it's what we should always focus on. We need to start thinking about some of the other scales we work at the landscape and at the larger scales, not because we shouldn't, but because we just haven't really focused on it. And so by opening up and inviting and welcoming areas to say, hey, you know, we are really going to focus on this larger scale at this point. These are cutting edge issues. These are the real driving issues of the 21st century, and we just want to make everyone aware that this is where you can go to do that. So that's what I mean by a welcoming. Not that we always haven't, but just let people know that's a direction that we're really focusing on.
And to follow up on that, you have several examples of ways that you could accomplish that potentially, but I'm interested in just maybe a little bit more detail. I mean, would it be providing the tools to do that? Would it be providing the places beyond Arboretum lands, but that are Arboretum-owned lands, or partnering with other groups, or, you know, like, what would be the specifics of how you would go about doing that?
Answer is yes. You know, I think there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. There's a lot of ways to do research. Some of it has to do with the talent and the facilities that we have there, the location that we have there. Again, as I said, I think we really need to focus on improving our university relationships first, making sure the departments are on board with this, and our communities on board with this. Get our house in a row first, and then expand out. But I think that there are tools personally that I can bring, and collaborators I can bring. I think that there's a lot of talent that's out there. There's a lot more talent we need to bring in. You know, that's maybe not even being used in the way that it could better be used, because of some of the, we've gone through a bit of a holding period, and some folks' duties they're spending time on that maybe they have even better talent in other areas, and try to get them to focus back, to give them the time to focus back on some of those other areas. Certainly through collaborations with the university, grant writing. You know, part of a package that the new director will bring with them is hopefully will be for me, will be some money they can bring in to help facilitate some pilot studies out there that could be used for collaboration with the other departments and faculty to entice them to come on in, the water's fine, start to bridge that, break that ice and get the work going. There's a lot of tools and mechanisms that can be used and should be used to start that.
Currently, I think the Leopold professor is the research director of the Arboretum, and I'm wondering how that role fits in with your vision of your professional development at the Arboretum and the type of research that you'd like to do.
Yeah, I think as a, one of the things that as a director, I think it's kind of a dual position. As a director, you have to be willing to put aside your own personal research. And after 25 years or so of doing research, I'm willing to do that as a director for maybe the research of the greater good, the research of the Arboretum and the bigger role of the Arboretum, and focus on promoting that and facilitating those linkages. Now, by my nature, I inject. That's kind of how I do my research anyhow. I'll have a big picture person. I'll put in some ideas. Get good people, get the very best there are. Trust them with what they do. Check on them once in a while, and let them run with it. And so I would see that at least primarily initially that would be my role, is to make those facilitations, not focus on the research, my own personal research role, if necessary ever again, but hopefully at some point when it's rolling and things are working well, do that. But I think as director, to give the big picture, provide those linkages, smooth out obstacles that come in to block what needs to be done, remove those bottlenecks, that's the director's role. Provide some research guidance, work with the research director there to make sure that we're focused where we need to be focused on that, and trust those individuals then to make good decisions to carry out that mission. And that's how I would see it evolving.
I like how you talked about the research mission, but one thing I didn't see was the teaching and how that fits into your vision of the Arboretum. And I talk about teaching, I'm not so much talking about teaching via outreach, but more integrated with the curriculum.
Yeah. I think it goes in hand with the research. What I would love to see here, and as I understand it, again, this is just based on a pretty limited sampling, is that there's still, if there's anything that's still going on between the departments and the Arboretum, it's probably the teaching. And I think that needs to continue and expand. What I'd like to see is that the faculty actually has ongoing research at the Arboretum that they can tie into their own teaching curriculum. So that instead of just going out there and doing look at birds or whatever, go out there and say, this is part of the research involvement that we have going on out here, and work that into the curriculum. So definitely strengthen that.
So Steve, we would love to have a $110 million endowment at the Arboretum. And clearly from your CV, you're successful in grant writing, but could you talk a little bit about your skill and experience cultivating donors and developing some non-traditional type money sources?
Yeah. I can't talk directly about cultivating donors without risking going to federal prison. Because for my entire career, I've been with the federal government, and when we want money, we don't cultivate donors, we increase taxes. And I don't do that either, so I'm running on that platform. But what I can say is that my equivalent of cultivating donors is promoting a research program which is solid, which shows results, which shows benefit, and then cultivating a base research budget, which I've been very successful at doing. So we can't get Aunt Mildred to give us $50 million and have it just go to our federal program. That doesn't work that way. But what I can say is I can go to Senator Mildred when they call and say, we're doing this work and we think this is benefiting the people of name the state in the Southeast, and because of that, we think that your district would really benefit from this work. But we can't solicit funds. We can't go to Capitol Hill unless we're invited. But if they ask us, then watch out, because I'll tell them what they need and what they want to know. And what they want to know is how they can help. And I'll say, if we had X number of dollars for this, here's what we could provide. And that's how you do it in the federal government. Now, in the private sector, it's a little different, but it's fundamentally the same basic process. First thing you have to do is you have to have something that they want, that they see as value. And right now we have an Arboretum as a fantastic place to visit, rich historic background, great examples of some of the types of restoration that's been done. It really hasn't evolved in the 21st century with 21st century issues. What this would say is different would be, we have that, absolutely we have that. But what we also have into that is this is going to be doing cutting edge research, not only for this 1,200 acre piece of woods, but something that could help protect global conservation or conservation out west, or all of these other areas beyond which recently or historically the Arboretum is really focused on potentially. That's a big seller. That's something that I think people can buy into to say, you know, even if you live in northeastern US or the southwest US, the Arboretum can do things that's going to save conservation out here. And what that does, which is a big difference from what the current Arboretum does, is it focuses, you know, southern Wisconsin, and our pool of constituents who we draw from is largely around the Arboretum in southern Wisconsin. This expands it. Huge. We've just jumped into a completely different pool, a much, much larger pool. And that makes that job a lot easier. When you give them a good product, then you have a bigger pool to swim around in. So my experience in direct fundraising, not so much, but equivalent, a lot. Questions?
Yeah, I have a question. We talked about conservation work and the, you know, big issues of the day. I guess my question is going to be kind of narrowing the focus down to ecological restoration again. And one of the occasional hot topics or ongoing controversies is it valuable? Is it right? Is it a valid activity to do, or is it just faking nature? And that's a topic that pops up now and then, and wonder how you would respond to that. How would you address questions about that? What do you think about that topic?
So in the Forest Service, we call conservation sustainability. That's our equivalent. If you're talking about conservation, are you talking about conservation of an individual plant species, like restoring a specific species to an area? Is that conservation? Because in the Forest Service, we do that, but we also think more about functional conservation. So for example, we know because of climate change and all the models and all the studies that in the southeast, the last of the red spruce will probably, by most indications, be gone by the end of this century. And so I'll get a call maybe from a forester saying, you know, we have X amount of dollars to do restoration ecology on my national forest. We have these areas that were killed because of mountain pine beetle or spruce pine beetle. 10 years ago, now they're just kind of shrubby briar patch up there. Should I use half of my restoration money to put spruce back into these areas? And I'll tell them, I won't tell them what to do, but I'll tell them what the science would suggest. And I'll say that science suggests that these areas will no longer be habitable within the next 50 to 75 years for that species. But science also suggests that these species would have a tendency to move into those areas. Now it's their decision as to whether they want to say, well, the science is wrong, the models are wrong, we don't believe it, we're going to put it back, hope for the best. Maybe we'll turn climate change around and get it cooling and everything will be good. Or they can say, well, you know, I hate to say it, but I think we might lose that species. What can we put in there that may have the same functional ecology, support the same types of wildlife species or other things, but have a much more resilient structure, be much more likely to survive into the 22nd century than what's there now. And that's a question that I think as a land manager or a private landowner, everyone needs to address, and it's science role not to make that decision, but give them the information, the tools that they can make that decision. Because ultimately, it's a personal. I think it's a personal decision you need to make. And so science is there to give them the tools, give them the information, but not make that decision for them. Any other kids?
So I was reflecting on UW as a place that's not so top down, but rather has a strong tradition of faculty governance. And my views of government are that they tend to be fairly top down, right or wrong. I was wondering what your thoughts are if you come here about moving from kind of top down bureaucracy with strong ideas of your own into a place that's really strong on faculty governance and what that might mean about input to you from faculty, students, and staff.
I think what I'm proposing here would be really dominated by faculty governance. Because what I'm proposing is to go out to the departments, go out to the faculty and say, come on in. And whoever comes in, that will help to determine what the research role will be at the Arboretum. So it's almost by default that it's going to be faculty governance. We'll tell them to come in, let's work together as a team to really promote the UW and promote the Arboretum as part of the UW. And so by your involvement, you help to govern.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, it's a very inspiring talk, so but I wonder if it's enough to say that outreach part is great, the place part is great, and we have to develop the idea part, because we live in a budget environment that's really different from the Carey Institute, and which is probably different from the art that you worked at in the 80s. And one of the reasons the ARB is in the situation it's in now is not just because of individuals or inattention or complacency, but because the budget situation is such that all of a sudden we have a park where 1 million people come a year, they don't pay anything, and we have to sustain the land. And the stress of that has changed the Arboretum. And I mean, the people there are very dedicated and brilliant, but that stress is not going to go away. So I think it's not true, or it's too simple to say the outreach part is working great. Now, so I guess the problem is the balance and how you can expand. I can see how at the end of the day, if we got that $130 million endowment or whatever, it would all work, and the research could float the land care and the park. But until that happens, there's a kind of it's like a house of cards, and the stresses within the institution are great.
Absolutely. No, that's a very good point. If they have still Chuck, let me illustrate what I'm talking about in a pie diagram. This is prime pie diagram. Say this is the University of the Arboretum right now. And right now, the way that it's broken up, and from what I can tell from talking to folks, this is kind of the perception, maybe a little more than that. That's about it. Okay, this is all of the stuff that's kind of public outreach. This is all of the tours and lectures and those sorts of things, call it PO. This is the amount of area that's really devoted to teaching. And this is the amount of area that maybe is devoted to research. So that might be, give or take, make those a little bigger or smaller, but that's basically the breakdown. Say we were able to start this approach, and somehow we got the pie just a little bit bigger, right? We got that first grant in, we got that first $150,000 grant in. We get the Dixie Cups out, we have a little bit of a party. Okay? So now what we have is the pie got just a little bit bigger. We still have this PO. At this point though, it got just a fraction of a little bit smaller. And what happened was we increased this research by that little bit amount. And then what happened is we had the teaching role. Maybe it just increased just a little bit too, because it goes with, as we talked about, the research. Great, super, a little bit of success. Let's go again. Let's build on what we've done there, and as any research knows, all the research actually is stuff you've already done that you're proposing, and so you're always working for the next research proposal, right? So what I expect is when folks come to the Arboretum, they're going to tell me they want to do something they've already done, that they know is going to work, and so that they can start working on the next thing. So, among friends, that's a secret. So, we do the next one. I need a bigger chalkboard. A little bigger. We do the same thing. 30 years down the line, when I am really, really ornery and ready to retire, and maybe 15 years down the line. Okay, here's the UW Arboretum. That's our public outreach. That's our teaching. This is our research. The amount of public outreach we're doing now at the Arboretum is a lot more than we're doing right now, but it's taking a much smaller amount of the total budget. So you don't go from here to here, you just, that's exactly how the Carey Arboretum did it. And that's how I propose we do it at the Arboretum. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe this would be the last question, Steve.
Okay.
We'll get you on your schedule.
I'm wondering where land care and actual on-the-ground stewardship of the resource fits into that pie.
The way that works into the pie is, let's go back to, let's say this is our regular pie right now. Everywhere. Because you have to sustain the facility. You have to sustain it or people won't be able to come there, won't be able to use it. Now what I would do is integrate that into every piece we do, whether it's public outreach, whether it's teaching or research. As facilities person, make sure we're accommodating the researchers that come out to do what needs to be done. Work with them so that when they need to be there to either teach or research, we're there to provide whatever resource they need to facilitate that. And that we don't do things like, cut over their experimental plots or anything that would deteriorate from that. So, but it is part of every aspect of this. And that won't go away. Thank you for your time.